Chapter 5 The Selkie Summer. There was little to do on the croft once the men had gone, but Robbie and Old Da were still kept busy in various ways. The eggs and young of seabirds were in season, and there were needed to provide something extra for the pot. The different kinds of moss that Janet and Elspeth used for dyeing cloth had also to be picked at that time of the year, and of course there was always fishing to be done. It happened to be an unusually fine summer that year, however, so that Robbie and Old Da were soon having a very high old time to themselves. For days at a time the weather held. The sun made the grass look greener than green, the sky bluer than blue, and the two of them chose the rest of these days to get their bag of eggs and young seabirds. Not that they were intent simply on getting the best of the weather on these occasions, mind you, for it was on the ledges of the high cliffs above the Vaux that the seabirds nested, and Robbie could easily have been blown into the sea if he tried scrambling down on these windy days. With Old Da to guide him, however, Robbie never made any such mistakes. He always climbed barefoot too, which helped to give his toes a grip in the steep rock face, and since he had a good head for heights, he enjoyed all this scrambling about the cliffs. As for Old Da, he had done the very same climbs in his young days, and so he was in his glory now, leaning over the cliff top to shout advice and encouragement to anyone that Robbie attempted. Gathering moss for dyes was another ploy for the finest weather, for then Old Da would take Robbie and Tam on the whole day of wandering footloose among the hills where such moss was to be found. To Robbie's great pleasure, too, as they wandered like this, Old Da told him one story after another, and there was only one thing that could cast a gloom on such a day. It was always Tam who gave warning of such a gloom, too, and it always happened in the same way. Tam would start to whine, and then the other two would realize they were approaching a sort of long, shadowy hollow where no flowers grew, and here and there in such hollows they would see a green mound with a door hole that was screened by ferns. Aye, the dog has a sixth sense for such places, Old Da would interrupt himself to say then, and they would all hurry past the hollow, for these green mounds were said to be the homes of a small people called Trows, and Trows were creatures of the other world which is not human. Once they were clear of such places, however, the feeling of gloom lifted from them, and Old Da would go on with his storytelling. Yet still he kept his voice low, for now his stories would be about the Trows themselves, and these were creatures which are quick to take offense to anything that is said about them. Moreover, Trows can make themselves invisible at will, and Trow ears are sharp ears. "Have you ever seen a Trow?" Robbie sometimes asked. But Old Da would not answer yes or no to this, and so Robbie had to be content with listening and wondering and keeping a sharp looking out on his own account. Mornings and evenings of every day were the times when the two of them went fishing, sometimes casting their lines from the cliff top, and sometimes rowing out in the small boat which was kept for this purpose. But it was the boat trips Robbie preferred, for there was always seals swimming in the Vaux, and this gave him the chance to follow his liking for watching these creatures at close quarters. The interest in seals was something else he had learned from Old Da, of course, for Old Da had long ago taught him the trick of holding the boat so steady in one place that they lost all fear of it. Little, feathery strokes of the oars were the secrets to this trick, and as soon as Robbie mastered his way of feathering with the oars, he found the seal swimming quite close to the boat and surfacing on all sides of it. They like music, Old Da told him, and to prove this he began to sing. Immediately the seals reared chest high out of the water to stare towards the sound of his voice, and Old Da laughed to see this. "I told you," he remarked, "and now I'll tell you something else about the Selkie folk and music. They have a great envy of the way people like ourselves can dance to it, and so they gather sometimes on a lonely beach where they can cast off their skins and take human form, and there they sing and dance to the music of the singing." Robbie stared at this, for neither he nor anyone else could ever be sure how much was true in old Da's stories, and how much was made up. He was still curious to know more about the Selkie dancing, however, and so he asked, "But how can they cast off their skins and change like that?" "You'll have to put that question to a wiser man than me," old Da told him. "For the only answer I can give you is that Selkies are a lot more than they seem to be. They are not animal creatures at all, in fact, but a kind of folk that have been doomed to live as Selkies, a strange gifted folk who have powers we do not understand." Robbie considered this, still feeling a bit doubtful. "What kind of folk?" he asked, and solemnly old Da answered, "Fallen angels, angels that sinned against heaven when heaven was shining new, and for their sins were cast out from all that glory." "Oh," said Robbie, feeling a shiver run up his spine at this. "Oh my!" And he shivered again, still not knowing what to believe, for it was hard to think of all these inquisitive creatures around the boat as fallen angels. And yet, when he looked at the wise and somehow sad expression on their dark, great eyes, he was more than half persuaded that old Da was speaking truly after all. "You're forgetting the feather," old Da reminded him, which was true. And with the way this had allowed the boat to rock, the seals were all beginning to dive out of sight. Old Da chuckled to see them scattered like this, and began to sing again in his quavery old man's voice. "I am an old man upon the land, a Selkie in the sea." "What's that song?" interrupted Robbie. "An old one that tells about the great Selkie," said old Da. But of course, this only brought another question from Robbie. "Who's the great Selkie?" he wanted to know then, and old Da told him. "Ah, well now, there's another story, Robbie. He's the king of all the Selkies, he is, which means he's the great bull seal that has his home deep, deep down in the deepest sea. That's where the Selkie's own country is, and that's where he rules, from a palace that has walls of crystal and floors of coral, with sea anemones for jewels and a roof of waving golden weed. Or maybe the roof is made of waving golden hair, the hair of drowned girls. Nobody knows for sure, for people can enter that country, but they never can come out again." "Why not?" asked Robbie, staring fascinated at old Da. "Why can't they come back?" "Because the great Selkie will not allow it," old Da told them. "And the drowned girls?" Robbie asked. "Who are they?" "Well," said old Da thoughtfully, "they do say that every now and then this great Selkie manages to tempt some poor lass to enter his kingdom, and when she tries to escape back to her own kind, as she must sooner or later would rather do, that is what happens to her." "I don't believe that," declared Robbie, deciding that old Da was just making it all up after all. But old Da just laughed at this and went on with another story. All this was long before that particular summer, however, and most of old Da's stories were dim in Robbie's mind by then. He was not a bit less interested in the Selkies themselves, all the same, and so old Da patiently taught him a little more each day about the true life of these creatures. "You know how they come ashore each year when their pups are due to be born?" said he, on one of these occasions. "Well, believe it or not, Robbie, these same pups are all 4 weeks old before they even start learning to swim. Yet, for all that, they still grow up to be the most traveled of any sea creatures." "Where do they go?" Robbie asked curiously. "Out into the Atlantic Ocean," old Dot told them. "And if they are bull selkies, they spend the whole of the first 7 years of their lives wandering all the seas of the world before they come back here to rejoin their own kind. Robbie sat watching the fishing lines they had cast, and thinking of all the Selkie pups he had seen. They were such helpless little creatures, he remembered, and it was strange, very strange to think of them growing up to be so adventurous. "We'll go and have a look at them this year, will we?" he asked, and old Da agreed. "Of course, Robbie. Come September, October, when the pups are born, we'll go off as usual and watch them to your heart's content." And maybe then, Robbie thought secretly, he would get to do at last what he had always wanted to do. Pick up one of the pups and hold it so that he could discover what a seal felt like. Old Da guessed what he was thinking, however, and said sternly, "But you're not to try touching them, mind you. You only get a bite from the sharp little teeth if you do that." "Who said I wanted to touch them?" protested Robbie, trying to look innocent. "And anyway, you'll not get me risking a walk into a nursery of Selkie pups with 2 or 3 of those big, great, powerful Selkies roaring around in the middle of it." "Now that's wise," old Da remarked, approvingly, and went on to talk of how he had learned about seals in his own young days. So in this way, Robbie managed to add quite a bit of that summer to the store of information he already had about Selkies. And when the menfolk came home for a weekend from the fishing station, which they occasionally did throughout the half-season, he began boasting to his father all he had learned. "Well," remarked Peter, after a while of patient listening to this, "I'm glad your old Da is telling you useful things nowadays, as well as all those fanciful tales of his." Old Da chuckled at this remark. Then he turned to Finn Learson, who had always been listening, and with his face growing serious again, he asked, "And what do you think I should tell Robbie about Selkies?" Finn Learson smiled a little smile that made him look as if he were enjoying some secret joke. "I think," he said dryly, "that you should tell him exactly as much as you think proper for him to know, for I also think that you are a very wise old man." "And you could be right on that," remarked old Da, looking hard at him. Robbie stared at them both, wondering what lay beyond this peculiar scrap of conversation, but nobody else seemed to notice anything unusual about it, and the weekend was so very quickly over that he had no time to ponder it as he would have liked. Very shortly after that particular weekend also, something else happened which put every other thought completely out of his mind. Old Da fell ill, very ill, and after a time it looked as if he would die.